sometimes the smallest among us can spark the most profound change. When a homeless black boy finds a millionaire's abandoned child in a dumpster, his courage shatters all preconceived notions and ignites a ripple of redemption and transformation. This is a story of survival, empathy, and the courage to fight for what's right. The night was colder than usual, the wind cutting through Malik's thin hoodie like a blade. He pulled it tighter around himself, shoving his hands into his pockets as he walked along the cracked sidewalk. The streetlights flickered above him, casting long shadows over the abandoned buildings that lined the neighborhood. This part of town had been forgotten, much like the people who lived here. People like him. At 14, Malik had already learned more about survival than most grown men. He knew which alleyways were safe to sleep in and which ones weren't. He knew which dumpsters had food that wasn't too far gone, which buildings still had a little warmth left inside. But no matter how much he adapted, he never truly got used to the feeling of being invisible. The way people looked past him, pretending he wasn't there. But Malik didn't need their pity. He had his own strength, his own sense of purpose. Even if the world didn't see it, he did. As he walked past the back of a gated mansion, he heard a sound that stopped him in his tracks. A soft whimper. Malik frowned, his breath visible in the cold air. He turned his head toward the alley behind the mansion, where the dumpsters overflowed with expensive garbage. Half-eaten meals, designer bags with broken straps, things the wealthy discarded without a second thought. But this sound, this wasn't the usual rustling of rats or stray cats searching for food. This was different. Carefully, he stepped closer, his heartbeat quickening. He pushed aside a torn garbage bag and froze. Inside the dumpster, wrapped in nothing but a thin blanket, was a baby. Malik's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think. The infant's tiny hands twitched, its face red from the cold. Its cries were weak, barely more than a whimper, as if it didn't even have the energy to scream any louder. Someone had left this baby here. Malik's stomach twisted in horror. He had seen a lot of terrible things in his life, but this was something else entirely. Without hesitating, he reached into the dumpster and carefully lifted the baby into his arms. The child was so small, so fragile. Malik felt the weight of it, not just the physical weight, but the reality of what had happened. Someone had thrown this baby away like trash. His first instinct was to wrap the infant in his hoodie, pressing it close to his chest to share his body heat. The baby let out another weak cry, its tiny fingers grasping at Malik's shirt. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I got you." Malik looked around, his mind racing. He had to get the baby somewhere warm, somewhere safe. But where? The shelters were overcrowded, and he knew from experience that they wouldn't just let him walk in with a baby and expect help. The police number. He had learned long ago that calling the authorities never ended well for kids like him. He had no one. And yet, looking down at the baby in his arms, he knew he couldn't just walk away. Gritting his teeth, Malik made a decision. He would find out who this baby belonged to, and if no one wanted it, he would protect it himself. He walked toward the mansion, his pulse pounding. Whoever had abandoned this baby had come from here. He was sure of it. The mansion's back door was slightly ajar, the golden light from inside spilling onto the stone steps. Taking a deep breath, Malik stepped forward. He had no idea what was waiting for him on the other side, but he knew one thing for certain. This baby deserved better, and Malik was going to make sure it got that chance. The world had never been kind to Malik. At 14, he had already learned what it meant to be discarded, to be treated like an inconvenience, an afterthought. He had spent years moving through the city's streets, blending into the background, invisible to those who had the privilege of comfort. People didn't care about homeless kids, not really. They looked away when they saw him, some clutching their belongings a little tighter, others crossing the street as if his very presence was a threat. Malik had long since stopped expecting kindness from strangers. He had learned to rely on himself, to keep moving forward even when the world tried to push him down. But through it all, he had never let the hardness of life turn him cold. He still noticed the small things. The stray cat that waited behind the bakery for scraps. The old woman who sat alone at the bus stop every evening, staring at a picture of someone she had lost. He saw people in ways that others didn't, because he knew what it felt like to be unseen. And now, as he cradled the abandoned baby in his arms, the weight of that knowledge settled deep in his chest. Somewhere behind the towering gates of the mansion before him lived the kind of people who never had to worry about survival. People like Mr. Howard, a man whose wealth and power built walls higher than the ones surrounding his estate. The businessman was a legend in the city, known for his ruthless decisions, his ability to turn struggling companies into empires. But he was also known for something else, his deep-rooted disdain for the poor. To Mr. Howard, people like Malik were little more than obstacles, burdens to society that didn't deserve sympathy or help. He had made his opinions clear over the years, in interviews, in policies, in the way he treated those who worked beneath him. The homeless were lazy. The poor were responsible for their own suffering, and if they wanted a better life, they should earn it, like he had. Malik had never met Mr. Howard, but he had felt the weight of his words every day of his life. The world listened to men like him. The world believed them. And now, Malik was standing outside his house, holding the greatest contradiction to everything Mr. Howard believed. The baby in his arms had come from this place. Malik didn't know why or how, but there was no mistaking it. The expensive blanket, the faint scent of perfume and wealth still lingering on the fabric, it all pointed to the same truth. This child had been born into privilege, only to be thrown away like nothing. For all of Mr. Howard's talk about worthiness, about people needing to earn their place, someone from his world had discarded this baby as if it had no value at all. How could anyone do this? He thought about his own life, about the nights he had spent shivering in the cold, wishing someone, anyone, would care. He thought about the way people had stepped over him when he was curled up on sidewalks, the way security guards had chased him away from storefronts when all he wanted was a little warmth. He had been invisible for as long as he could remember. But this baby wasn't going to be. Not if he could help it. The child let out another soft cry, its tiny body trembling. The blanket barely covered it, offering no real protection from the cold. Malik's chest tightened as a deep, burning rage swelled inside him. He had seen cruelty before. He had lived it. But this was something else. Without thinking, he reached in, his fingers brushing against the baby's icy skin. Carefully, he lifted the infant, cradling it against his chest. It was so small, so fragile. "I got you," he whispered, his voice thick with something he didn't fully understand. "I got you." The baby stirred, its whimpers softening. Malik knew he couldn't stay here. The baby needed warmth, food, help. But where could he go? The shelters were full. The police wouldn't believe him, a homeless black boy, if he told them he found a baby in a dumpster. And even if they did, would they even care? His only choice was the hospital. Tightening his grip on the baby, Malik pulled his hoodie around them both and stepped back into the streets. People walked past him, their eyes flickering toward the bundle in his arms before quickly looking away. A man outside a liquor store sneered, "What you doing with a baby, boy? You steal that?" A woman shook her head as she passed. "God help us. These people will do anything for attention." Malik gritted his teeth and kept walking. He had spent his whole life ignored. But now that he was carrying a baby, suddenly everyone had something to say. Still, not a single one of them stopped to help. The hospital was a few blocks away, its bright lights glowing like a beacon. Malik pushed through the exhaustion, his legs aching, his arms wrapped tightly around the tiny, shivering body. He didn't care if they turned him away. He didn't care if they looked at him with the same disgust everyone else did. He just needed someone to help. The hospital doors slid open, the rush of warmth hitting him like a wave. Nurses and doctors moved through the lobby, too busy to notice him at first. Malik stepped forward, his throat dry, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please," he said, "the baby." A nurse finally turned, her eyes widening when she saw what he was holding. "Oh, my God," she gasped, rushing toward him. "Where did you—" "I found them," Malik said quickly, his voice steady, despite the way his hands were shaking. "In a dumpster, behind a big house. Someone left them there." More nurses gathered. Someone took the baby from him, moving quickly toward another room. Malik tried to follow, but a security guard stepped in front of him. "Wait here," the guard said, eyeing him suspiciously. Malik swallowed hard, his body tense. He had done the right thing. He knew he had. But the way the guard looked at him, the way the doctors whispered to each other, it was the same as always. They didn't see a hero. They saw a problem. A nurse came back, her face pale. "We ran a scan," she said slowly, almost as if she didn't believe her own words. This baby is Nathaniel Howard." Malik frowned. "What?" The nurse hesitated. "This is Mr. Howard's son." Malik felt the ground shift beneath him. "Mr. Howard?" The same man who built skyscrapers and controlled entire industries. The same man who said the poor were lazy, that people like Malik were nothing but leeches on society. The man whose own child had been discarded like garbage. The nurse was still talking, her voice urgent. "We need to call him right away. This is going to be huge." Malik took a step back, his heart pounding. He had expected this night to be another like all the rest. Cold, lonely, silent. But now, everything had changed. The baby he had just saved wasn't just any baby. It was the son of the most powerful man in the city. And now, Malik was about to walk straight into a world that had never wanted him in it. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, every television station, every online headline, every whisper in the city echoed the same unbelievable truth. A homeless black boy saved the son of billionaire Nathaniel Howard. It was a story too powerful to ignore. Mr. Howard sat in his office, gripping the edges of his desk as the news anchor's voice filled the room. Breaking news. Nathaniel Howard's infant son, reported missing just last night, was discovered abandoned in a dumpster. But in a shocking twist, the child was rescued by a homeless teenager, Malik Carter, who risked everything to ensure the baby's safety. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Howard's eyes burned as he turned off the television. He had spent years shaping the city's narrative, telling anyone who would listen that the poor were poor because of their own failures, that people like Malik deserved nothing because they had earned nothing. And yet, when his own blood, his own flesh, had been thrown away like garbage, it wasn't a wealthy friend, a powerful ally, or even the authorities who had saved him. It was a boy from the very streets he had ignored. The weight of it settled heavily in his chest. Nathaniel Howard was a man who built his empire on certainty, on numbers, on business, on control. But for the first time in his life, he was uncertain. Who had done this? Who had taken his son, only to toss him aside like a piece of waste? The police were already investigating, their theories piling up. But none of it mattered to Howard as much as the undeniable truth staring him in the face. His son had lived because of a boy he would have never spared a second glance. And that truth burned. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Malik sat on a stiff chair outside the nursery, his body still aching from exhaustion. For most of his life, people barely noticed him. They walked past him, looked through him, made him feel as if he didn't exist. But now, everyone wanted something from him. Reporters had crowded the entrance of the hospital, desperate to get a glimpse of the homeless hero. Nurses stole glances at him as they passed by, their expressions filled with something Malik couldn't quite place. Admiration? Pity? Curiosity? He hated it. He hadn't done this for attention. He hadn't saved that baby for reward. He had done it because it was right. And now the world was watching him as if he were some rare animal in a zoo. The door to the nursery opened and a nurse stepped out, giving him a small nod. "He's stable," she said. "You did the right thing." Malik didn't respond. He wasn't sure what the right thing even meant anymore. Mr. Howard arrived at the hospital an hour later. His presence was undeniable. Security guards flanked him. Doctors scrambled to accommodate him. The hospital administrator practically tripped over herself, trying to reassure him that his son had been given the best care possible. But Howard barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on one person, Malik. The boy sat alone, his hoodie pulled tight around his shoulders, his face unreadable. Howard had spent his life avoiding people like him, but now there was no avoiding him. Steeling himself, he stepped forward. Malik looked up as Howard approached, his dark eyes steady, unwavering. For the first time in years, Nathaniel Howard hesitated. What could he possibly say? He had built his empire on the belief that people like Malik were the problem. And yet, here he was, standing before the boy who had saved everything that mattered to him. He cleared his throat. You found my son." Malik didn't blink. "Yeah." A tense silence stretched between them. Howard felt something twist in his gut. Guilt? Shame? He didn't know. But what he did know was that there was nothing he could say, no amount of money, no grand statement, that could erase the reality of this moment. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel Howard wasn't the most powerful man in the room, because the boy in front of him, the homeless boy he had once dismissed as nothing, had just proven himself greater than Howard could ever claim to be. Outside the hospital, the city was changing. Malik's story was everywhere. People who had once ignored him now spoke his name with admiration. The same strangers who had once turned away from him in disgust now whispered about his bravery. And yet, the irony wasn't lost on him. He had been here yesterday. He had been cold, hungry, ignored. And nobody had cared. It took saving the son of a billionaire for them to see him. And that, more than anything, was what Malik would never forget. The world had always been a cruel and indifferent place for Malik, but for the first time in his life, it felt as if it had stopped to truly see him. He sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his fingers lightly tracing the seams of his hoodie as he tried to process everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. He had gone from a nameless boy on the streets to the one who had saved the son of the most powerful man in the city. The weight of it all was suffocating. He hadn't done this for fame. He hadn't done it to be praised or rewarded. He had done it because it was right. And yet, here he was, sitting in a private hospital room, waiting to hear what came next. The door opened, and Nathaniel Howard stepped inside. His presence filled the space, commanding, powerful. But there was something different about him now. The arrogance, the cold superiority that usually accompanied men like him had been stripped away. Malik didn't stand. He didn't need to. Howard hesitated for a moment, then slowly took a seat across from him. "I owe you more than a thank you," he said, his voice quieter than before. "You saved my son, and I don't know how to repay that." Malik shrugged. "I didn't do it for a reward." "I know." Howard exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. He looked tired, more exhausted than Malik had ever seen a man with so much power look. "But that's exactly why I have to do something." Malik didn't respond. He wasn't sure what he expected, but when Howard finally spoke again, his words were the last thing he could have imagined. "I want to help you." Malik frowned, shifting slightly. "What?" Howard leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "You deserve better than the life you've been given. And I have the power to change that." A bitter chuckle escaped Malik's lips before he could stop it. "Funny. Yesterday, you wouldn't have even looked at me." Howard flinched, but he didn't deny it. "I was wrong." His voice was heavy, filled with something Malik couldn't quite place. Regret? Shame? Maybe both. I was blind to a lot of things, but you opened my eyes. Malik studied him carefully. He had spent years reading people, understanding their intentions, their lies, their truths. And right now, for the first time, he saw something real in Nathaniel Howard. Sincerity. "I want to offer you a place to stay," Howard continued. "A real home. Not a shelter, not temporary assistance. Something permanent. And not just that. I want to make sure you get an education. The best education. Whatever school you want, whatever future you want, I'll make sure you have it." Malik's breath caught in his throat. A home, a future, a chance. Things he had never dared to dream about. And yet, he narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Howard met his gaze without flinching. "Because I was wrong about you, about people like you. And if I don't do this, if I don't try to make things right, then I'm no better than the person I was yesterday." Silence stretched between them. Malik had spent his life being promised things that never came. People had pretended to care before. Social workers, strangers who gave him pitying glances, teachers who spoke about his potential, but never stayed long enough to help. But this was different. Because Nathaniel Howard wasn't just trying to change Malik's life. He was trying to change himself. The announcement came later that evening. Standing in front of cameras, reporters, and a world that was watching, Nathaniel Howard took a deep breath before addressing the crowd. "For years," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I have spoken about success, about responsibility, about the idea that people must earn their place in the world. I believed that those who struggled simply hadn't worked hard enough, that their suffering was a result of their own choices." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I was wrong." The reporters murmured, surprised. This was not the Nathaniel Howard they knew. Howard looked directly into the cameras, A 14-year-old boy saved my son's life. A boy I would have once ignored. A boy I had spent my life writing off as someone who had no worth, no future. He exhaled sharply, and yet, when faced with a choice, he did not hesitate. He did what so many others, including myself, have failed to do. He acted with compassion, with bravery, with integrity. Malik watched from the side of the room, his arms crossed as he listened. I cannot erase the years of prejudice, the harm that my words and actions have caused, Howard continued, but I can start making things right. And I am beginning with Malik Carter. The crowd erupted with questions, cameras flashing, voices overlapping. Howard raised a hand to silence them. From this moment forward, I will ensure that Malik has every opportunity to succeed. He will have a home, an education, and the resources to build the future he deserves. And more than that, I am making a commitment to use my wealth, my power, and my influence to actually help those I once ignored. Malik's stomach tightened. He had spent his whole life being unseen. And now, the whole world was watching him. That night, as he sat in a warm room with a real bed for the first time in years, Malik stared out the window, his mind racing. This wasn't just a new life. It was proof that the world could change, proof that he had changed it. And as he lay down, exhaustion finally pulling him into sleep, a quiet, unfamiliar thought settled in his mind. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. The world had always tried to define Malik by what he lacked. He had no home, no wealth, no family to protect him from the cruel indifference of society. For years, people had walked past him as if he were nothing, as if his existence meant less simply because he had been born into struggle. But in a single moment, one decision, one act of bravery, he had redefined himself, not just in his own eyes, but in the eyes of the world. Malik had never thought of himself as a hero. He was just a boy trying to survive, doing what he had always done, paying attention to the things others ignored, listening to the cries no one else seemed to hear. He had saved Nathaniel Howard's son because it was the right thing to do, not because he had expected anything in return. But his actions had forced an entire city to confront something uncomfortable. How many other Maliks had they ignored? For years, the world had told him his life didn't matter. And yet, when the most powerful man in the city was in need, it was Malik who had stepped forward. People who had once dismissed him now spoke his name with admiration. Strangers who had once turned their backs now wanted to shake his hand. But Malik knew better than to let their sudden change of heart erase the truth. It took saving the life of a rich man's child for them to see him. He thought about all the others who weren't as lucky, kids just like him who went unnoticed, who went unheard, who would never have a moment in the spotlight. And that, more than anything, fueled his next decision. He wasn't just going to take the opportunities given to him. He was going to make sure the world never ignored kids like him again. Nathaniel Howard had learned a lesson, and he was trying to make things right. The man who once saw people like Malik as nothing more than statistics, as obstacles to his perfect city, had been humbled. He had looked into the eyes of the boy who saved his son and realized that everything he had believed was a lie. His public apology, his promise to change, none of it erased the years of harm he had caused, but it was a start. And Malik, he was no longer just a boy on the streets. He was no longer just a name people overlooked. He had been given a home, an education, and a future. But he had also gained something far greater than all of that. a voice. For the first time in his life, people were listening, and he was going to make sure that they heard not just his story, but the stories of every kid like him. Kids who had been abandoned, ignored, written off as lost causes before they were ever given a chance. Because Malik understood something now. True change didn't come from money or power. It didn't come from policies written in high offices by people who had never set foot on the streets. It came from people who cared enough to act. It came from the ones who refused to walk past suffering, who refused to accept a world where children were left to fend for themselves. It came from a 14-year-old boy who had nothing and gave everything anyway. Malik's story wasn't just about saving a baby. It was about saving himself, about proving that even when the world tried to erase him, he mattered. And now, standing on the edge of his new future, he made a silent promise to himself. He would never forget where he came from. He would never stop fighting for the ones who still lived in the shadows, because compassion and bravery had changed his life. And now, it was his turn to change the world.